Hello, I'm Brian Canfield, and today we're further going to unravel the mysteries of stained glass. In particular, we're going to discuss soldering. This is a very important technique in leaded and copper foil stained glass panels because that's what really keeps everything together and keeps it durable and from falling apart. Soldering is a technique that it takes a lot of practice to get really good at it, but most importantly, you have to understand your tools, and also, of course, safety is important as well. So I'd like to start by discussing some of the tools that you will use. And the most important, of course, is the soldering iron. This is what applies the heat to the solder. This is, something that is inherent to soldering, and if you don't know your soldering iron very well, you're not going to accomplish good techniques. There's a huge variety of soldering irons out there. The one in particular that I like is the Hakko 456. It has a ceramic element on the inside which allows it to maintain the heat much longer in using it a lot as well. There are other soldering irons out there. They get much bigger for different applications like rebar. Notice the difference in the size of the tips, pretty obvious. I like about a 3/16 to a 1/4 inch tip. That gives you real nice finesse and kind of intricate techniques, but it's also big enough to where you're not soldering in one area for a huge amount of time. An electrical soldering iron, that's not really going to work for what you're doing with stained glass. Again, this tip's about the minimum that you want to get. Another important tool is going to be, of course, the solder itself. It comes in a couple different varieties. You'll see things like 50-50 and 60-40. Now that's the percentage ratio of tin and lead in solder. I prefer a 60-40 blend. Some people prefer 50-50. Really, you're just going to have to try them out and see what works for you. There really isn't that big of a difference though. But again, I'm a 60-40 fan. In addition to your soldering iron and solder, you're going to need flux. Now, flux is what you're going to apply to the lead or the copper foil in order for the solder to adhere properly to those projects. Really what happens when the lead sits for a while, or even copper foil, you get what's called oxidation on the surface. And flux really plays a part when you apply it to that metal. It cleans off that oxidation and allows the solder to get into those pores and really adhere to it. So flux is a very important thing to use as well. There's different kinds. Me personally, I like a water-soluble, non-acidic flux. Again, they're going to react a little differently for you, an acid-based flux or a non-acid base. However, I say again, you really need to try different ones out to see what's going to work for you. A couple other tools real quick is going to be scrapers. That way you can clean off the metal. This is also another scraper you can use. Some people like to use wire brushes to prep the metal along with the flux. But there's quite a few techniques we'll go over. So I have here a leaded panel, real simple. Here I have a couple different kinds of lead that's going to be used. I have some 1/2 inch, I have some 1/4 round lead. I even have some zinc in here, which is solderable. Not only can you solder zinc, lead, copper foil, you can also solder brass. They're all relatively the same though as far as the process. So once you have your project built, you have it all nailed in, you have it secure so it's not going to be loose and fall apart, that's when you're ready to solder. Now, I'm going to analyze, my different solder joints. And sometimes, if you haven't cut the joints very well, you might have a couple gaps in there. There's some techniques that we can do to fill in those gaps, but the best case scenario is you want really nice, tight seams where you're going to solder over. That's very important. In addition to copper foil tight seams, you're going to want the lead to be really tight in the seams. So if we look down here, what I'm going to do is focus purely on just soldering the joints where the two pieces of lead come together on lead in particular. I'm going to really try to get that solder to flow from the center of that joint out in equal measurements, probably about 1/8 of an inch from the center of the joint. So the first thing I want to do is, again, put down that flux. That's going to prep the metal. And it doesn't take a lot, just a little dab. And then I'm going to look at the tip of my soldering iron to make sure that it's clean. Sometimes if you let it sit for a long time, it'll build up some crud. So I take my wire brush there and just kind of brush it off. Some people, they'll have it's like a sponge with some water, and they'll use that to clean their brush. Some people even dip it in the flux as well to clean their soldering iron. Me, I just like to use a wire brush. If you let your iron sit for a long time, you got to be really careful not to burn your lead, because when that has been sitting for a while, that's when it's really the piping hot, you know. So in the very beginning, you got to be real careful about how close you get to the lead. So what I'm going to do is just apply a little bit of solder on the tip here, and it almost instantly liquefies. You can see it drip. And then I'm going to just circle around on the joint, let it dry, let it cool a little bit. It solidifies. I'm going to analyze it, see if I need to add any more. I'm going to put just a little bit of drip down. And the solder, one of the general rules of soldering is that the solder will follow the heat. And so I'm just kind of moving it around, trying to get that nice equal spacing from the center, and let it cool, and then it'll solidify and you have a nice solder joint. Now you notice this drip that I have on there, that looks pretty bad, but it should come off relatively easy because I didn't flux in that area. And now you notice how that solder didn't actually stick to the lead itself. Now as far as safety goes, stay away from that tip. You know, anytime you touch your finger or wood or any kind of flammable material, that's what you want to stay away from with the soldering tip. I'm also not using a soldering mask while soldering, just for sake that you can hear me talk. But most appropriately, when you're soldering, you will get fumes and breathe them, so you want a well-ventilated area. And a mask like this looks like overkill, but this is what it's going to take to keep those small particles and lead fumes to get into your system. Really what you want to do is, if you find some disposable masks like this, you need to read the package to see if it's appropriate for soldering. Not all masks are going to prevent you from inhaling those fumes. So now we've done a little bit of soldering on lead. Here on this corner, it's right next to this wood, there's a little bit of zinc. Now what I want to do with zinc is, if you look at it, it's kind of dark gray in color. Now that's not the original, you know, fresh zinc color. That's where I can come in with one of my scrapers and get in there, and you scrape away where you're going to solder. And what I'm doing is I'm getting some of that oxidation off that edge. And now it's nice and shiny, and that's going to be a little better to solder. So what I'm going to do is get in here with my scraper and scrape this edge, just like that. Some people think that if you come in with a wire brush, that's appropriate, and that you can come in there and clean off that oxidation. But I'll be honest, my theory is that it just kind of pushes around the oxidation, versus if you have a scraper, you're literally scraping it away, getting off that surface. But with zinc, you're going to do the same exact thing. You're going to put a little bit of flux on there. You're going to get your iron, check the tip again, brush off any crud that might be on there, come in with the solder, add the heat, let it drip on there, and just kind of hold it above the surface. And sometimes on a denser metal like zinc, you're going to have to hold it on there a little bit longer, because it takes a little bit more heat for it to start to absorb that solder. Now, we're going to move over to the copper foil. Copper foil is another technique that you can employ to get glass to hold together. Rather than soldering the entire or just the joint on lead, you're going to solder the entire line here of copper foil. Make sure that copper foil is on there burnished and sticking. Again, you're going to come through and just apply a little bit of flux over the area that you're going to solder. Now what I like to do is a technique that's called tack soldering, and that's where you're just going to add a little bit of drip in two areas to keep those pieces together, and then you're going to come in and apply more solder. So you see how I just added a small drip on that side and another small drip on this side. Once it solidifies, it actually holds it together just with those two little beads of solder. That's called tack soldering. Now that it's going to stay in place, and some people, to keep them in place, will put a little bit of tape as well. But again, that tack soldering technique is really good for keeping that glass together. Now I'm just going to run what's called a bead of solder down this line. And I'm just kind of feeding the solder into that soldering tip, heating it up, running it along the copper foil line. I'm trying to really close up any gaps in there, any seams. And once I get that on just a little bit, I'm going to kind of look at it. And if you notice it's not quite sticking to the copper foil like it should, just go and add a little bit more flux. My motto is you go in, make it work and stick together, and then you go back and make it look pretty. And making it look pretty is just by adding a little bit more solder if you need. Try to be consistent with your solder in the aesthetic, meaning that if it's round, try to keep it round the whole way. That's what we call a bead. If it's flat, you want to keep it flat the whole way. And notice I'm just kind of running down all the way. And if you heat it up all at once, it kind of liquefies and it solidifies all at once, and it makes it real nice and smooth. And then of course you're going to have to flip it over and do the other side. Now if you find that you have a big gap on that back side, you can always take like a small piece of wet paper towel and put it on the back side. That way it kind of keeps it from pooling on the back side of your copper foil as well. So those are just a couple techniques that you want to keep in mind when soldering. Make sure that if you do use a good soldering iron, you might need a temperature control, and that way if you notice that things aren't quite working for you, you can adjust that temperature control left or right, up or down as far as percentage. And you know, keep your tools clean, keep your area clean, and make sure you wear a good mask when soldering. So hopefully we'll see you next time. My name is Brian Canfield. We'll see you again.